Okay, so why is there something rather than absolutely nothing at all? Just kind of let that hang in the air for a second. It's really the ultimate philosophical question of our existence, right? I mean, is the universe just a giant, lucky cosmic accident? Or is there an actual reason, a grand designer, a prime mover behind the whole shebang? Well, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving deep into centuries of some of the most profound intellectual debates ever had about the existence, or, the non-existence of God. We're going to look at some absolutely fascinating arguments put forward by history's greatest thinkers, and we're going to examine them right through the lens of the evidence they actually used.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Here is our roadmap for the intellectual boxing match ahead. 1. The big question. 2. The cosmological argument. 3. Hume and logical fallacies. 4. The teleological argument. 5. Evolution versus design. And 6. Science and faith today.
Starting off with Section 1, the big question. Let's look at the rules of engagement.
Right, so before we can debate the actual origins of the universe, we kind of need to understand the framework these historical thinkers were using. Their logic was based on what's called a posteriori knowledge. Now, that's just a fancy Latin term that means knowledge relying on empirical experiences and real-world observations. So, unlike abstract math, where you can solve a massive problem entirely in your head, the thinkers we're analyzing today, they literally started by just looking out the window. They observed the physical, tangible world around them and used those everyday observations as their starting line.
And building on that, they utilized inductive reasoning. Think of this like being a detective walking onto a crime scene. You gather specific, little clues, a footprint here, a broken window over there, to build a general conclusion that is highly, highly probable, even if it's not 100% mathematically certain. These philosophers were essentially gathering clues from nature to build a probabilistic case for the cosmos.
Moving right along to Section 2, the cosmological argument. Enter St. Thomas Aquinas.
To really grasp this, we've got to talk about St. Thomas Aquinas. This 13th century monk came up with what he called the 5 ways, and the first 3 of those form his incredibly famous cosmological argument. Let's move through and see how this builds. Step 1 is motion. He observed that things are constantly moving, and since things can't just move themselves out of nowhere, there has to be a first unmoved mover. Step 2 is cause. Basically, everything has a cause, which naturally leads backward to a first uncaused causer. And step 3 is contingency. This means things in our universe are temporary. They exist, sure, but they don't have to exist. Therefore, Aquinas argued, there must be a necessary being that has literally always existed to kick the whole process off.
Now, the absolute beating heart of Aquinas' logic here relies on stopping what's known as an infinite regression. He firmly believed that an infinite, never-ending chain of causes going backward forever is just logically impossible. Without a definitive starting point, like an eternal, transcendent being completely outside of time and space, there wouldn't be any subsequent causes. Simply put, without a first cause, there would be absolutely nothing right now. But since there is something, well, a first cause absolutely must exist.
Which brings us to Section 3. Hume and logical fallacies. Time for the skeptical counterpunches.
In philosophy, every grand theory eventually meets a fierce critic. So enter David Hume and Bertrand Russell, who delivered some of the ultimate skeptical counterpunches to Aquinas. And this brilliantly illustrates one of their absolute biggest critiques, the fallacy of composition. Think about a brick wall. The fallacy happens when you assume that just because the small parts of a whole have a certain characteristic, the entire massive thing must have it too. Like, a wall is made of small red bricks, right? But does that mean the wall itself is just one small red brick? Of course not. Hume argued that just because individual things inside the universe have a cause, it is a massive logical leap to assume the universe as a whole requires a cause.
Bertrand Russell actually perfectly cemented this concept in a really digestible, everyday way. He said, just because each human has a mother doesn't mean the universe as a whole has a mother. I mean, it's a sharp, witty observation, and it really makes you pause and question whether the rules inside the box actually apply to the box itself.
As you can guess, this led to a massive clash of perspectives. Russell essentially accused the cosmological argument of special pleading, like making up a special one-off rule for God that doesn't apply to a single other thing. For Russell, the universe is just a brute fact. It exists, end of story, and it doesn't need to be explained any further. But, on the flip side, thinkers like Gottfried Leibniz and Richard Swinburne fiercely defended the need for an explanation. Leibniz argued that even if you have an infinite universe, it still requires a sufficient reason outside of itself to exist at all. And Swinburne added that, hey, if one simple external being explains the amazingly complex universe, well, that's just the most logical conclusion to draw.
But here is where it gets wild. Modern science actually throws a massive wrench into this classical philosophy. Quantum physics suggests that certain subatomic particles might actually be, in a weird way, totally uncaused. They just pop in and out of existence. If that's true, it completely challenges Aquinas' very first premise, the idea that absolutely everything in the universe has a cause. I mean, if things can just happen without a cause at the quantum level, the whole architectural foundation of the cosmological argument really starts to shake.
All right, let's pivot to Section 4, the teleological argument, looking at the purpose within. So, if the cosmological argument is all about how the universe started, the teleological argument is totally focused on why it looks the way it does. To grasp this, we first need to define telos. It's a Greek word that means end or purpose. Thinkers in this camp argue that the universe isn't just some random chaotic collection of atoms, it is deliberately goal-oriented. And this sets up Aquinas' fifth way, and later, the really famous observations of William Paley in the field of natural theology. Just look at the stunning regularity we find in nature. On one hand, you have the incredibly complex, beautifully synchronized systems of human anatomy, like how our lungs or digestive tracts work. On the other hand, you have the predictable, powerful rhythm of ocean waves crashing on a beach. Proponents of the teleological argument look at all this and say, come on, this complexity, this perfect, intricate order, it cannot possibly just be the result of blind chance. To them, there is a clear design here, and design automatically implies a designer.
Aquinas actually explained this using what's known as his archer analogy. He observed that non-intelligent things in nature constantly act in a regular, goal-oriented way to get the best result. Think of an arrow. An arrow has no brain, right? It can only hit a bullseye if it is actively aimed and released by an intelligent archer. By that exact same logic, unintelligent natural objects act towards a deliberate purpose because they are being actively guided by an intelligent designer.
Which brings us to Section 5, Evolution versus Design. Darwin enters the chat. So in the 19th century, Charles Darwin stepped onto the scene with a scientific framework that directly challenged this deeply held teleological worldview. His theory of evolution offered a radical new explanation. He showed that the mind-blowing complex life we observe didn't necessarily need to be placed here in its current finished form by a designer. Instead, through the relentless, ongoing process of natural selection, survival of the fittest, over millions and millions of years, species adapted perfectly to their environments. The environment itself shaped the complexity. It provided a completely naturalistic mechanism for what otherwise looks exactly like intelligent design.
And wow, the friction between classical design arguments and modern biology is intense. Evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins sums up the modern scientific critique brilliantly when talking about William Paley's design argument. Dawkins flat out states, Paley's argument is wrong, gloriously and utterly wrong. For Dawkins, and honestly many evolutionary scientists today, the watchmaker of nature isn't some divine being. It's just the blind, unconscious forces of physics and biology at work.
Finally, Section 6, Science and Faith Today, Finding a Modern Synthesis.
So the crucial point is, does evolution just completely destroy the argument for God? Well, not necessarily. Let's look at how modern thinkers attempt to synthesize these totally clashing viewpoints. A lot of modern philosophers and theologians have actually adapted the argument. Frederick Tennant, for instance, argued that the very process of evolution itself has a purpose, to develop complex life. John Polkinghorne looked up at the stars and argued that our universe is just incredibly finely tuned to allow human life to exist at all. And then Richard Swinburne noted that, sure, while science beautifully explains the how of genetic mutations and physical laws, it completely fails to explain the why. Like, why do these laws exist in the first place, and why do they coordinate so perfectly to favor us being here? This whole idea is known as the anthropic principle.
Which leaves us right back where we started, looking out at the vast, mysterious cosmos. Is the precise fine-tuning of our universe, the laws of gravity, the mechanics of evolution, and the very existence of matter, is it all just an incredibly lucky random chance? Or is it the ultimate undeniable evidence of an intentional grand design? I really encourage you to look at the world around you, weigh all the evidence we've explored today, and decide for yourself which argument truly holds the most weight. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.